Hello and welcome to our virtual field trip, The Natural History of Florida. We'll be visiting the Florida Natural History Museum in Gainesville, the Weeden Island Cultural Center, and Fort DeSoto's Quartermaster Museum. We'll be looking at the natural history of our planet, and we'll also include how humans fit into this whole program. When we're done with this PowerPoint, which is the content section, there will also be some video tours of these three places for you to watch. At the conclusion of this PowerPoint and those videos, there will be a lab report for you to submit, and this report will count as your grade in oceanography class. To begin, we'll just take a brief history of geologic time. Earth is dated to be about 4.65 billion years. Most geologic time scales have a large division called eons, and one eon, loosely described as the Precambrian, is about 7/8 of Earth's history. No humans yet, sorry. And this as the formation of the planet, the formation of the oceans. We'll be discussing that at length in class. Then you have the Paleozoic or early life, the Mesozoic, middle life, and the Cenozoic, which is more modern life. That divides the second eon, the Phanerozoic eon, which is characterized by Earth having complex life. So during the Precambrian time, the oceans were formed, the continents were formed, a lot of natural processes were occurring. Earth's first life also came to be during the Precambrian, although for most of that it was very simple single-cell life. And Earth's continents have been moving around. Pangea means all lands in Greek, and Earth's had several Pangeas, quote unquote, throughout its history. The latest large landmass is actually referred to as Pangea, and Florida, as you can see, was wedged where North America, South America, and Africa were. When we look at the geology of Florida, we can see all three continents' influence in geologic samples. The earliest evidence of life are microfossils that resemble modern algae called stromatolites. You can see the stromatolites pictured below, and you can also see fossilized above. Those fossilized have bands that are oxidation, which is showing Earth's oxygen being created by processes that liberate oxygen. Photosynthesis would be the main processes. The first multicellular life showed up later in the Precambrian, and by the end of the Precambrian, we started to see the modern taxonomic groups forming in the animal kingdom, as well as protists and the bacteria. The Paleozoic era, the first era in the Phanerozoic, refers to ancient life. The opening of the Paleozoic is marked with an explosion of multicellular life. Many scientists agree that's because oxygen reached a threshold, and now that allowed for more complex life. Respiration is how organisms get energy. Respiration without oxygen, called anaerobic respiration, does not liberate much energy when you compare it to aerobic or respiration with oxygen. So as oxygen built up in the atmosphere, this would allow for more complex life to occupy the planet once a threshold is crossed. So we open up the Paleozoic with a Cambrian explosion, a proliferation of life. We study fossils to piece together the mystery of ancient life. One of the most important fossil beds is the Burgess Shale found in Canada. So the Paleozoic ended with another huge event, the Great Dying or the Permian extinction. This is characterized by a lot of flood basalts, which means volcanic activity and a lot of outgassing of carbon dioxide, and a lot of immediate climate swings in the fossil record, showing that many organisms perished because they could not adapt quick enough. Early Paleozoic seas were characterized by diverse invertebrate groups. You can see the lower image on the right are trilobites, and they are one of the more common fossils during this era. They superficially resemble modern horseshoe crabs, and horseshoe crabs are considered living fossils and do date back to these ancient times, but the trilobites themselves are now extinct. The middle Paleozoic seas during the Ordovician period were dominated by cephalopods and also have coral groups and primitive fish. The first fish we find in the fossil record lack jaws, jawless fish. The cephalopods were very, very prominent. We still have cephalopods today. We have octopus, squid, cuttlefish, and the chambered nautilus, which actually has a shell and resembles these ancient cephalopods. You can see from the Florida Museum of Natural History some of the cephalopod fossils on display there. Our late Paleozoic seas during Devonian time were called the Age of Fish because of that diversity. Now, I mentioned coral, and we know today coral's being bleached and scientists are worried about it going extinct. But during the Paleozoic time, we've had two extinctions of coral. We had rugose coral, which went extinct, and tabulate coral, which went extinct. Coral are related to jellyfish, anemones, and they have evolved several times throughout Earth's history. So the Great Dying characterizes the end of the Paleozoic. So at the beginning we have a proliferation of life, and then at the end we have the Great Dying. During the late Paleozoic, life has also colonized land. So we start to see life move from the water to land. Now, I've read studies saying that oxygen played a role in this as well, because the ozone, which is made of oxygen, ozone layer, filters out this harmful radiation, and as our atmosphere matured, this harmful radiation was filtered out, allowing life to move from the water to land because of this natural shade of radiation. So many studies point to that as being a pivotal point in the colonization of land, which happened during the Paleozoic times. Now in Florida, our state stone is a type of coral. You can see its image there. Below that is a fossilized sea biscuit, which is a relative of modern echinoderms. An echinoderm has a spiny skin. We have sand dollars along those lines, starfish or sea stars that are in this group. Now, I've been lucky enough to do some scuba diving in springs and seeing these fossils along the walls. It's like diving in a museum where you can look on the sides of the walls and see these fossils, often dinner plate size, just in the springs walls. So it's quite amazing that Florida has all this limestone on it that are made up of fossils, coral and sea biscuits and things like that. Now the middle era, the Mesozoic, is referred to as the age of reptiles because, you know, the dinosaurs, which kind of evoke fear and interest, and you know, kids love dinosaurs, and traps a lot of scientists, including myself, into a life of curiosity. But in Florida, we did not have any dinosaurs. Florida was underwater at the age of dinosaurs, and then dinosaurs were land dwellers. But the image on the right is a fossilized skull found in the Museum of Natural History. Our first fossils, our oldest fossil on display, you can see is a turtle, and it's the pectoral girdle of a turtle. You can see the image around the late Cretaceous, which the Cretaceous is part of the Mesozoic. Florida is underwater. So like I said, there's no dinosaurs. We were a great underwater reef. The ichthyosaur on the right was a reptile that lived in the Florida area. So it's not a true dinosaur, but it is a large water reptile that is fossilized. So the dinosaurs never made it to Florida. Now, the end of this Mesozoic area is characterized by a meteorite impact. On display is a meteorite. It's not the meteorite, but it is a meteorite. And meteorites can be made of metals, or they can be stony, or they can be made of carbon. But it is believed that the Mesozoic era was ushered out with a meteorite impact that caused a mass extinction. There is an impact crater in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, which is the likely area of the impact. Now, the Cenozoic Era, or the Age of Mammals as it's referred to, is the one we currently live in. Now, mammals evolved from reptiles back in the Mesozoic, but they were small generalists that were mainly nocturnal. They did not get their chance until the reptiles were wiped out, the dinosaurs were wiped out by the meteorite. So mammals and birds crossed this threshold. Some reptiles crossed it, but the dinosaurs did not. That handsome fella happens to be my son, and he is posing with some megalodon jaws. That is one of the more famous Florida fossils. The most common Florida fossil is the shark tooth. Sharks happen to be cartilaginous fish, which means they don't have solid bones. The only solid parts of the shark is the teeth. The cartilage decays really quickly. The teeth are mineralized, so and they fall out after every meal. So very common fossils. Now the megalodon, which is extinct, can have teeth up to 6 inches long. So they're huge shark teeth. It's a lot of fun to collect these fossils. I used to scuba dive off the coast of Venice, Florida, collecting megalodon teeth. The Peace River is known for megalodon teeth. I've even found megalodon teeth on hikes around the beaches in Egmont Key. So megalodon teeth are a prized find here in Florida, and they're very, very popular, linked to one of the more famous fossilized Floridians, the megalodon. Whales also evolved in our shallow seas. The whales are tracked back to almost wolf-like creatures that occupied the intertidal zone, so moving from land into the ocean. So mammals evolved on land. Their lungs would point that out, and there were niches opened in the ocean that could be utilized by mammals. And whales are one of the organisms that move back to the water from the land. Now, Florida's geologic history spans back over 5 100 million years. We study it by core samples, and you can see that drill and seismic equipment right there. And we study the geologic history by looking at core samples. So looking at Florida, we can see we have South American, African, and North American history in our rocks. When Pangea split up, it's obvious that we stuck with North America, but we do have basement rock that points to this origin. Limestone, which covers Florida, much of Florida, is calcium carbonate deposits, and it's from the great oceans that covered us, and then it precipitates out, so we have this layered limestone that covers our African-based bedrock. You can see from the image there, we have a huge carbonate bank, and if you recall a couple of the images earlier, that's built up when Florida was under the shallow seas. And our carbonate bank thickest can be over 2 kilometers. So the early Florida peninsula was much smaller when the oceans were higher, and as the ocean sea level dropped from the formation of ice during ice ages, it's exposed. The Florida platform is about 2/3 larger than the state of Florida, so sea level rises and falls naturally with ice age to non-ice age, glacial period to interglacial period, and we've built up quite a nice carbonate shell over our basement rock. We call that type of topography karst topography. Karst topography has sinkholes and springs and caverns that are typical of that carbonate deposit landscape, because carbonate dissolves in water, so we have this huge extensive underground aquifer that wells up in springs, or when we remove the water, sinkholes form, and that is karst topography. The image below of the ledge with the fish, that limestone ledge, that was taken while scuba diving in Crystal River, one of our nearby springs. That's King Springs, the source of Crystal River. Now, in our geologic past, we had this great ocean called the Tethys Ocean or the Tethys Sea, and it really doesn't exist now because Pangea separated and the land masses maneuvered themselves into their current position. The remnants remain in the Mediterranean, Black, and Caspian Sea area. The Caspian Sea happens to be a lake now because it's cut off from the other seas. But the Tethys Sea was a once great ocean that is now non-existent. So during our last glacial maxima, we had a lot of megafauna. The fossil room at the Natural History Museum shows a lot of that megafauna. You can see the Florida platform was more exposed when all that ice was on land, and we find a lot of land-based fossils that are now in the shallow seas surrounding Florida. So sea level rises and falls, Florida shrinks or grows, and that carbonate bank is added to, and we have layers of land fossils, water fossils, land fossils as we hunt through Florida. Some of the megafauna from that room, the mammoth in this image has this huge tusk. It's a relative of elephants. Mastodon is a little bit smaller, little sturdier bones and shorter tusks, is also a relative of the elephants. They're not really closely related, but they're in that same general group of pachyderms, that large trunked mammal. So we had mammoth we had Mastodon. We had saber-toothed cats, as evidenced here. Saber-toothed cat fossils found in Florida. We had bear dogs and hoofed mammals, primitive horses. These images are all from the Natural History Museum Megafauna Fossil Room. Mega means huge, so megafauna means big animal, literally. We did have horses, as I mentioned, proliferating the state. We had this giant armadillo-like creature called the Glyptodont. They originated in South America and moved up into Florida. We had giant sloths, and you can see by the size of that claw, compared to my hand, just how large these creatures were. Terror bird is another apex predator that used to roam the plains of Florida. Now let's introduce humans to the equation. Humans developed, the lithic stage is considered when we were hunters. The archaic stage is when we started gathering. The formative stage is classified as when we started to settle down into permanent settlements. The classic stage is when the indigenous Americans had society formed. And then the post-classic stage refers to the European colonization of the Americas and that paradigm shift. Now that was all published by Phillips in his study of American archaeology. So this is the accepted standard for the stages of development in American human history. So the timeline, the Wisconsin maxima, the glacial maxima, when Florida was its largest, ended about 15,000 years ago. And the first people that arrived to Florida was about 14,000 years ago. They're called the Clovis culture. That Clovis is based on one of the spearheads they use, the Clovis point. A point is the tip of the spear. And looking at their technology at the time, that was called the Clovis technology. So sea levels are dropping, Earth is warming, and then we hit a period called the Younger Dryas, and that's when our megafauna disappeared, and then people disappeared from the area. I've read and talked to a lot of experts on this Younger Dryas. What happens was this warming trend on Earth stalled, and Earth started to cool a little bit again. There is some evidence for meteorite impacts at the time, smaller scale than the one that changed history at the end of the Mesozoic, but that may have contributed to the pressures put on North American wildlife that disappeared. But anyway, the Younger Dryas period ended, and then another group of people returned. We see our first coastal settlements about 5,000 years ago, and we start finding pottery about 4,000 years ago, and we study pottery. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 500 years ago, we have the Spanish influence in Florida, and then the Seminoles entered Florida, and Florida became a state. And then we're going to talk a little bit about local history to wrap up today's presentation. So we mentioned the Seminoles. I mistakenly thought Seminoles were the original or indigenous people to Florida, but really Florida already had Europeans in it when the Seminoles came down from Georgia, but they are called the unconquered people because descendants of them eluded capture and remained free in Florida. So they're the unconquered tribe. Spain originally came to Florida, but then Florida went to Britain and France, and then back to Spain again. And that's something that I didn't know. So Spain regained Florida at the end of the American Revolution. And then Spain ceded Florida back to the United States. So we've had a lot of influence in Florida. Florida became a state in 1845, and William Moseley was the first governor. During the Civil War, Florida was spared much of the carnage, if you will. Georgia, we know about Sherman's march to the sea and the burning of Atlanta, but there was no huge decisive battles fought in Florida, although Fort DeSoto was used in the Civil War. Actually, Fort DeSoto was first ordered by General Lee, but then it was captured by Union forces and used by the Union while the interior of the state remained in Confederate hands until the end of the war. So there's a map of Fort DeSoto. Mullet Key is the main one that we study. There's smaller keys. If you're in the Bahamas, key is spelled with a C-A-Y, but it's still pronounced key, an island. A key is considered an island. Indigenous people lived in Mullet Key, lived off of the Gulf of Mexico, surviving on fish, clams, conch, oysters. And then the Spanish landed here in somewhere between St. Pete and Clearwater, and they called that Espiritu Santo Bay. DeSoto, whose Fort DeSoto is named after, came ashore about 10 years after. Spain surrendered Florida to Britain, 1763. Again, Fort DeSoto was commissioned by Robert E. Lee for coastal defense. The Confederate troops briefly occupied there, but then the Union won that, took over, and used that to blockade Tampa Bay. Egmont and Mullet Key were approved as armament batteries, and when we visit Fort DeSoto, you'll see some of the batteries where the weapons were. We have gun turrets there. As a matter of fact, the first image on the left is an aerial image from Google Maps. We do meet in marine biology at Battery Bigelow. That's a gun turret pictured below that is literally offshore, right off the beach, and you can walk right to it. And so those images are of Battery Bigelow. And then Battery Laidley is where the fort is, and there's Battery Laidley is where we can tour the fort. Those images are of Battery Laidley. They're taken from the Quartermaster Museum. And then the image lower left is an actual gun on display out by the fort. So Fort DeSoto has quite a history itself. It was purchased by Pinellas County in 1938, but then it was recommissioned and used as a bombing range in 1940. After World War II, Mullet Key was sold back to Pinellas County, along with several other keys and islands. And in 1977, Fort DeSoto was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. More images from the Quartermaster Museum. You can see images of when it was a bombing range. This is from where the targets were located, and pictures of actual bombing trips over Fort DeSoto. There's a picture of the lighthouse of Egmont Key and some of the early bathymetric maps of the area. Today, I use Fort DeSoto extensively for field work. Uh, it is a beautiful county park. The image on the left is the lighthouse on Egmont Key, which is just across a channel. And then the images on the right were taken at the fort itself, Battery Laidley. I do encourage a actual visit if you live in this area. I will be posting some videos from these points of interest as part of this field trip, as well as videos from Weeden Island and from the Florida Museum of Natural History. I hope that you have enjoyed this brief presentation, and I hope that you have a great day.